I am live. I am continuing with Reshad Feild's book, The Invisible Way, A Time to Love, A Time to Die, for my beloved wife who edited this book. Reshad says here, this book is a love story about love that faces death. To truly know that this body dies and that this is the only time we have is the most powerful weapon that we can ever have. With this understanding, we can begin to live passionately, not wasting a moment of the precious time that is allocated to us, plunging gratefully into the immediacy of living. We work now for the future of humanity, and as we know we are loved, time will be on our side. I have not read this book before, so I'm traveling this journey along with you. Chapter 3. He is in Turkey. We left the museum courtyard in silence. How could I speak of the realization I had just had? It would sound almost too banal, too naive, just to say that what would perhaps change the whole course of my life would be to know that I was loved. I knew that my teacher understood, that he was kind, and that there was no need to speak at that moment. Outside the museum, he turned to me and said that we had been invited to attend a special gathering that evening. "You're welcome to come," he said. "These people are my friends. They are brothers on the way. I will be around at 8 o'clock to take you if you wish." With that, he excused himself, and I watched him walk up the street. The evening meeting turned out to be a late night session, as so often happens in Turkey. Anticipating this, I had rested in my hotel room for the few hours that remained before the agreed time. It had been a day I would never forget. There was so much to digest that I was sorely tempted to stay in my room, but I had not come all the way to Turkey to be alone. I was here to discover what direction my life would take. What was more, I had been unable as yet to really speak about the realization I had come to, and I knew I must do sooner or later. I can't be certain, but I believe the house we visited that night was the same one I had been to some years before. Suddenly I recognized many of the faces from previous visits, and there were the usual greetings while cups of tea were brought in from the kitchen. Shoes were piled high by the door, and when I got used to the low lighting, I realized how many people there were in the room. Our host showed us to an empty space, and very soon a group of musicians started to play. Everyone present made 2 circles, kneeling on the ground with their arms tightly interlocked. I was in a dervish gathering once again. I joined with them in Dikir, the special sacred practice of the remembrance of God. 3 drummers and 2 flute players wove an intricate pattern of music. At the same time, one man sang from the Quran in Arabic. While we chanted the name of God in unison, the music always in our hearts. One by one, the dervishes got up, went to the center of the room and started turning, whirling and whirling, faster and faster, recalling the vortex of life itself. The dikir lasted well into the night. At the end of the evening, an old sheikh, who had been very kind to me on previous occasions, came forward. He had had great influence on my life, and I always had felt myself cleansed in his presence. "Ah," he said, embracing me deeply, "it is good to see you once more in Konya." Much later, my teacher and I walked back to the hotel, agreeing to meet for breakfast the next day. He said that he wanted to explain certain things, and also to see whether I had understood anything during the day. I suspected when I saw the glint in his eyes that he sensed what I had experienced, but still did not know how to express. That night I lay awake, watching the early light creeping up over the roofs of Konya and bearing the dawn call to prayer from the minarets throughout the city. "So," he said as the breakfast was brought to us, "where do we go from here?" The question took me aback, since I had fully expected the answer to be provided for me. As so often, I had been caught by my own presumptions. My teacher was a master of this, always setting me up so that I would have to fall back on what lay within. "I want you to go back to the question," he continued. "You may have had some sort of helpful realization, but if you're not quite clear about what you have understood, then little good will come of it. As I have said, most people do not prepare themselves to ask questions. It's like the art of conversation, real conversation." And here he leaned forward to make his point clear. "Real conversation arises when two or more people agree to come together in the name of a question. Each person offers a contribution, adding to the distillation. What is left, however, is not an answer, but a deeper question. On her deathbed, Gertrude Stein was approached by a great friend and confidant, who asked her, 'Well, Gertrude, now for the answer.' 'No,' said Gertrude with her last breath, 'now for the question.' He continued, 'You have come all this way to Turkey to ask for my advice. Now it is essential that you express in words what you must perceive. It is not necessary just to think you know the answer. It is necessary both to ask it in words and perhaps even to write it down, so that you are quite certain you know what you want. Now tell me, did you not receive some sort of understanding after I left you in the museum?' He smiled. 'Don't worry. If you took all the trouble to come to see me in Turkey, it was also up to me to take the trouble to do all that I could to find out what you really wanted and then to help bring it out into the open.' Taking a deep breath, I turned around to face him. If I knew what I loved, that I was loved, I said, would I not begin to know the source of love itself? He smiled again and nodded his head in acknowledgement. We talked on into the day. I was made to face this question from every angle. I had thought that I was quite clear about what I was asking, but the more that we analyzed it, the more complex and fascinating it became. We touched on psychology, on Freud and Jung and how they would have approached the situation. We discussed the implications of what, perhaps, knowing the answer, would bring forth from within. I was asked to reach deeper and deeper into the question until he was perfectly satisfied that we could go no further at that time. Finally, he turned to me and said, "There is a punchline that could be useful. If you know that you are loved and thus come to the source of love, what is the effect? What is the meaning of the famous saying in our tradition, love is the cause and love is its own effect?" But enough. This afternoon and this evening I am busy, but tomorrow we can go to Ephesus to visit the chapel of the Virgin Mary. We will go and pray that you will be guided on your way, for I sense that it is time for a change in your life. To be quite sure, we need to ask. The next morning we set off early on the bus for the long journey to the port of Izmir. There we would hire a car to take us to Ephesus. It was a good day and much of the tension that had been building for so long had gone. I felt as though I was once more connected to the way, and the experiences of the past 2 years were beginning to fit into place. It was even possible to realize how each one of these experiences had, step by step, led me to understand what I needed, and how that understanding was so necessary to be passed on to others. I had been to Ephesus before and looked forward to it. There's something very special about the place. Since my first visit, I had sensed that the Virgin Mary held a meaning that I had yet to understand. We talked much about this on the bus. He told me that Mary is held in esteem by Christians and Muslims alike, and that since there is an inner esoteric understanding that underlies all religions, this was not mere coincidence. He also reminded me that in every mosque in the world, the mihrab, or prayer niche in the eastern wall of the mosque, is dedicated to the Virgin. It is a pity more Christians do not know this, he said, laughing. Mary is the perfect woman, complete in herself, having the perfect matrix, the perfect receptacle from which Jesus could be born. We stayed in a small hotel just by the fish market in Izmir. That night we ate fish straight from the sea, chosen by ourselves from the baskets that lined the roadway outside the market. I sensed that it would not be long before I would make another journey, but nothing was spoken about it that evening, and we retired to bed early, tired after the long bus ride. We drove the hired car to Ephesus the next morning, and my teacher suggested that we climb the 6 kilometers to the chapel on foot, as thousands of pilgrims do each year. Once before I had made the pilgrimage in December, and the freezing winds that had made the walk anything but pleasant. This time it was another matter. Birds were singing, the hills were covered in wildflowers, blankets of blue and yellow gently moving in the breeze, and the air was filled with the smells of spring. We waved greetings to the shepherds who were leading their goats out to pasture, and our steps seemed to get lighter and lighter as we reached the top of the hill. We looked over the plains and meditated on what it must have been like nearly 2,000 years ago, when Mary first came here after the death of her son. We brought candles outside the chapel and, lighting them in prayer, placed them in boxes of sand, sparkling with other candles left by those who had already visited earlier that day. A nun was kneeling in the front, and I watched the intensity of her prayer. In the pew behind, 3 Muslims, equally deep in prayer, stood with their hands open and raised in front of them. My eyes filled with tears. Somehow I knew that my own prayers were already answered. That night my teacher turned to me and said what came as no surprise. It is time for you to leave and go back to England. Destiny brought us together once again, but this time you found the answer without being told. It is a good sign, and I shall pray that you will continue to be guided along the path that you have chosen. There are 1 or 2 things that I would like to say to you, so please listen, for words have difficulty expressing such things. I once said to you that the answer lies in the egg. That was to get you interested enough to ask for the real meaning behind my words. If you had not been interested in healing and the spiritual arts, I might have put it in another way. But if you now relate the egg to the matrix and remember that what I have said about Mary and Jesus, you may understand on a much deeper level. Never take things on their face value alone. There is always something else that underlies whatever you see or feel. Do you remember what I said to you those years ago? Your body is the Virgin Mary, the Spirit of Christ. The mind cannot understand these things, but there is another inner sense that can comprehend. If you always remember that there is one God, one absolute being, which is the principle underlying all religions and all true paths, then, little by little, these inner senses will develop usefully. You want to know that you are loved. God loves you, it is said, but there is only God. Think about this, for there must be no more duality in your life. The key for you is woman in her many aspects. That is why I took you to Ephesus. Can you understand? Everything you see In here is the relative world, is what we call a witness of God. It is the form that you may carve the essence, but by itself it is no more than a shell. That's when I say it is time for you to study women in her many aspects. I mean, the deeper and deeper levels that can be understood. If you will remember that there is only one God, then his manifestations will be seen to be the expression of his love. Turn to the highest and know that you will be looked after as you are indeed loved. May God grant you freedom. We sat silently, and then he went upstairs to bed. Although what he had said was not really a surprise, there was once more that feeling of sadness and separation that I had the last time that I left Turkey. It was different this time though, for I could see that life really is the teacher, and so those that help us on the way are manifestations of life, which is God's gift to us. Just to remember to always be grateful. I walked along the road by the hotel meditating on this. A half moon hung over the ocean. The sky was filled with stars and seemed to go on forever. Fishing boats were in the bay. You could just see their outlines in the moonlight, their lamps sending out shimmering lines of light towards the shore. It was not hard to be grateful that night. When I got back to my room, there was a note on my bed. Dear friend, it read, here is the name and address of a woman in London. I've known of her for many years and you can trust her implicitly. Go to her soon. In the meantime, I will write her a letter by way of introduction, explaining some of the things that have transpired between us over the years. She will lead you on the next step of your journey. Again, I remind you not to take things at their face value. I'm going to leave very early in the morning, so if I do not see you, don't worry. I have to go back to Konya for a while, but I will make prayers for you each day at the seat of Mevlana. The letter was signed in Arabic. I put it beside my bed and was soon asleep. For some reason, I did not wake up until late the next morning. The man behind the desk told me, your friend has gone and he has paid the bill for you both. So, this is chapter 3 and chapter 4 is to come. Today is the 3rd of April 25.